Hi, thanks for watching UsableNet's on-demand webinar, Inclusive ADA Principles for Mobile App Accessibility. My name is Bethany Servin, and I'm the Marketing Director here at UsableNet. The takeaway that we would love for you to have from this presentation is that the WCAG principles help the mobile experience for every user. This webinar was recorded live on May 12, 2021. With presenters Jason Taylor, Chief Innovation Strategist at UsableNet, Luca Boschkin, our Senior User Interface and Experience Designer at UsableNet, and Joseph De Niro, an Assistive Technology Specialist with Helen Keller Services for the Blind and Team Lead on our user testing team here at UsableNet. We'll go now to Joe introducing himself and talking about his experience.
I'm an assistive technology specialist with Helen Keller Services for the Blind. My role is that I do evaluations of students anywhere from the teenage years all the way through adults, and we evaluate our clients to see where they are as far as their knowledge of how to use a computer, if they have any assistive technology background at all, and then we provide instruction to them so that they can either go to some sort of college situation or to get back into the workforce. All of our clients are either visually impaired or totally blind, the instruction that I provide is on either desktop computers, mobile devices. We do everything from understanding the operating system, how to navigate file management, productivity software, as well as surfing the internet and how to navigate that. And then my role with UsableNet is I'm the sort of the team lead here as far as digital user testing. And what we do is we're a team made up of individuals that represent the disability community. And we test websites either on the in the mobile space or desktop, as well as mobile applications to determine their accessibility for people with all disabilities.
Great, Joe. I was wondering if it's okay, could you maybe give us a background of your journey with regard to coming blind, like where your history of your blindness?
Yeah, I was diagnosed in 1994 with a degenerative disease called retinitis pigmentosa. At the time, I was working in the hotel industry, in hotel management. I spent almost 10 years in that industry. At the time when I was diagnosed, there really wasn't any real effect on my vision. But as time went along, the vision slowly deteriorated. In 2002, I began using a white cane. 2005, I started to use assistive technology. At the time, that was Zoom Text. And probably 6 or 7 years ago, I became more exclusively using a screen reader, which is JAWS, although I'm familiar with all screen readers across all platforms.
With Joe's help, we can provide not just a technical understanding of WCAG principles, but a strong emphasis on the user value of these experiences as Joe shares his real-world experience. We start off today with answering the questions. What are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, and how can we apply those in a mobile space? WCAG can be applied to any type of device that interacts with the web. When we talk about mobile accessibility is about making sure our websites and mobile applications work for anyone who is using a mobile phone or other mobile devices, including users with disabilities. We'll go now to Joe sharing how he uses mobile and how that differs from how he navigates the internet on a desktop.
So I use my main device that I use is an iOS device. I use an iPhone, although I do have an Android device as well, and I run the screen reader that's on that is VoiceOver, which is built in to the iOS operating system. And the main difference is, while you can use an external Bluetooth keyboard, these devices are designed to be used with touch gestures. So I navigate around using different swiping gestures or tap gestures, or we also use what's called touch exploration, where you just move your finger around the screen to find the elements or the content on the screen that you're looking for. And then, after you find the content, then you can use other gestures to interact with it.
For today, we'll look at the 4 principles of WCAG that represent the foundation of accessible web content. These 4 principles are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. We'll show some basic examples that will help you understand every principle and hopefully help you to improve your design work and process. We go now to Luca presenting the first principle, which is perceivable, as he explains and presents the questions we should ask ourselves when understanding this principle.
And that a person with a disability would not be able to perceive? Or does our app or website work with different types of assistive technology devices? Or does our app consider a wide variety of disabilities? So Jason, let's start by talking about small screen size.
Perfect. So Bethany, can we go to the next slide? So small screen size is an obvious one, and I hope that you picked up on Joe's description of how he uses his mobile device, whether he's on a mobile site or whether he's on a mobile app. One of the go-to sort of activities for him is to touch the screen. So to use touch as the exploratory component. So obviously, if there's lots of activity, there's lots of elements and lots of features and functions inside of that small screen, it's going to be hard for him to touch and listen to all the different ones. So maybe, Joe, you could give us a sort of an example of like when it's too busy, what potentially happens and what your sort of default is in terms of sort of getting around that problem, just so people can understand how important it is for spacing and for simplicity of interface.
So it's actually funny that you asked this question, because there's an app that I use on a regular basis, and they just did an update to it probably 2 days ago, and I used it last night, and they added a whole level of, it's a communications app, and they had a whole level of new buttons on it for push to talk for the different messages, and it's now very difficult for me as I'm moving my finger along the screen to delineate those from the actual who's sending the message. So it's forcing me now to revert to swipe gestures, and if it's in a message group where there's a significant amount of messages, I have to now swipe a significant amount of time just to kind of find where I left off in a particular conversation. So it can make navigation significantly challenging at times.
Yeah, and I think for visual people who might be thinking, well, how do I understand Joe's issues, right? If who's obviously using a screen reader. It's really about simplicity of the interface. If you feel like the interface is too busy, it's way too busy for Joe. Because he's actually using his finger. That's a sort of the touch point radius. And if there's lots on that interface, then it's easy for him to slip off elements and slip off action points because he touches the next element that's too close to the element that he wants. And then he has to resort to basically tabbing through all of the features on the interface to find the one that he wants. Although actually using touch would be a lot quicker if it was well designed and spaced. Let's move to the next example of this principle, and I think I'll put this back to you, Luca, to sort of talk about these.
Yeah, the next example is about zoom and magnification, and it is actually somehow related to what we have just heard from you, Jason and Joe. So let's say that in general, good content structure and optimized layout are somehow just the starting point of making our digital products more usable and accessible for a broader audience. But some users, especially those with visual or cognitive impairments, in this case, should be able to easily zoom or magnify content. And this can be achieved either at the browser level, if we're talking about a mobile web, as well as at the mobile platform level. If we are considering browser level, users in this case can, of course, use the pinch to zoom functionality, or either adjust the default text size, or use the browser reading mode that displays the main content at a specific text size. On the other hand, if we consider native apps at the platform level, user can, for example, set a default text size in the device settings, use screen magnification, or use the magnifying lens feature. And the most common issues in this scenario are related to the missing support of all these features that I've just listed. So for mobile web, make sure, for example, that your web application or your website supports the pinch zoom functionality. Then in terms of responsive design, use default or try to use default text sizes that are appropriate for the viewport you are targeting. And whatever, let's say, if the project it's let's say suitable, consider applying or adding on-page controls for adjusting font size. On the other hand, for example, if we are more focused on the native app scenario, try to follow specific guidelines about typography, whether you are designing for iOS or Android, for example. And of course, support specific accessibility features related to resizing text, like dynamic size for iOS, for instance. Next, we have text contrast. Another important aspect closely related to visual impairments is text contrast. Text contrast is, of course, very important because it helps preserve a good level of legibility for each one of us, but especially for people with visual impairments. And for mobile user, this is even more important because, of course, we take our devices everywhere we go. So context, like, for example, walking under bright sunlight, plays a fundamental role in how we interact with small screens. And WCAG define the minimum text contrast for any web content display on a screen, considering the color of the text in combination with the color of the background. And it basically sets two minimum contrast ratio values, one for any text which should be at least 4.5 to 1. And the other one is for bold text, which should be at least 3 to 1. And the contrast ratio for bold text is particularly tricky, especially if we try to apply it in a mobile context. So according to the WCAG, bold text can be any text styled in bold and set at the minimum font size of 14 points or 18 pixels, or alternatively, any regular text set at minimum font size of 18 points or 24 pixels. However, of course, these units were identified as ideal for any user maybe sitting in front of a 15 inches monitor and not a mobile phone. So here is how you can, let's say, better translate these font size references for a more realistic mobile scenario. So you can take the default font size for the body text recommended by the platform guidelines you are referencing. For example, iOS suggests 17 points for default font size, body text, and Android, on the other hand, suggests 14 points. And multiply this value by 1.2 for bold style text or 1.5 for regular style text. Either way, the result you will get will be your target font size for which it can be considered safe to use the lower 3:1 contrast ratio, which gives basically a wider range of color options for designers. And in the same way, like text, the WCAG, on the next slide, please, the WCAG also sets the minimum contrast for any interactive elements and visual elements, such as icons, charts, or infographics. And of course, in a mobile scenario, designers has to deal with limited space often. So that's where, for example, icon-only buttons can come in handy. However, try to be bold with your designs. Don't use colors that are too subtle, and make sure that this type of visual element has a minimum contrast of at least 3:1 with the surrounding color. Next, we have orientation. So, Jason, visual impairments apart, other users with, let's say, limited use of their hands or other physical impairments may experience other types of issues, like those related to screen orientation, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think this one is, and I'll get Joe to give his importance as well. Essentially, just really what you want to do is make sure that whatever you're producing works in both orientations, landscape or portrait. And that's important because a lot of the times there may be a physical reason why a person uses a phone or needs to use a phone in that particular mode. So maybe Joe, you could give an example of that, because I know you've got your own experiences, but you also have experiences other people that you work with, and where this would actually be appropriate.
Yeah, I've had students where a visual impairment is not their only disability, where they have mobility issues as well. So, for example, if they're trying to use swipe gestures in portrait mode and they have mobility issues, it can be more challenging for them to perform that swipe gesture because there's not a lot of width in the screen. So a quick fix for them would be to move it to landscape mode. But if the app doesn't support that, then the gestures won't work. So the gestures will still behave as if the phone was still in portrait mode. So then they really, it doesn't solve the problem and creates sort of an accessibility issue for them.
So, Luca, maybe this is because I think it will probably come up with obviously a range of apps only sort of work in portrait. What's the answer there? Is it because you've got to look at the type of application you're building and whether you think the swipe gesture would be an important component, or how would you sort of address that?
Well, let's say that technically, from the strictly, if we take the guidelines or accessibility guidelines, the accessibility guidelines states that we should always support any type of both, basically, the views, either landscape as well as the portrait view. The only exception is from the WCAG is that unless the application or the website or whatever the interface is somehow mimic or simulates the actual purpose of an interaction. So the classical example here it will be that you are designing a web application or a native app like a sort of a piano player. So in this case, the only supported view would be the landscape, because it actually needs more space to recreate a sort of simulation of a physical object. But all the other, let's say, scenarios fall typically in the other option. So from the standards perspective, native app should also take into consideration both the view, because of course you cannot predict which would be the most useful or the most preferred view for a specific user. Next, we have provide easy methods for data entry. So alongside different type of orientation, also providing alternative types of data entry should be always considered on mobile. Text entry in particular can be very time consuming and pretty challenging in certain circumstances, especially for people affected by motor impairments. Text entry also increases the chance of errors, so designers have to think about alternatives to reduce the amount of text entry, like, for example, providing select menus, radio buttons, checkboxes, by automatically entering known information with autocomplete, or provide shortcuts for the user to reuse information entered earlier during the process, and support dictation. I actually have another question for Joe. What helps you in terms of data entry, specifically on mobile?
So when we're talking about data entry, I utilize the dictate feature sometimes. What is also helpful is the selection of the appropriate virtual keyboard for a particular edit field. So, for example, if a form requires an email address, to have the virtual keyboard that has the @ sign and the period right next to the space bar on the main keyboard, or to have the number pad keyboard for a phone number. So that makes it improves the efficiency of the completion of the form.
Thank you, Joe. Next, we have principle number 2, which is operable. To understand operable, question to consider here are, does our interface require an interaction that some of our user cannot actually perform? Or can users successfully interact with our application using a touch display, a keyboard navigation, or a screen reader? So Jason, if we consider touchscreen, buttons are probably the most prevalent interactive element of our mobile interfaces, and finding their placement within the UI is super important, isn't it?
Yeah, so if we can move on to the next slide. So let's talk about this sort of example of this principle. I think this is something that people probably recognize in their own world, which is, this visual that we have up actually shows a sort of heat map on a mobile device and a heat map on a tablet in terms of where are the easiest places for someone to essentially touch and explore or touch and submit. Interestingly, probably most apps, especially on mobile, are built right-handed as opposed to left-handed, which is interesting because I'm not quite sure many apps are built on the left-handed side. But essentially, and I was going to get Joe to talk about sort of there's the obvious how do you where do you put interactive elements to make them the easiest, but I also think that there's an element of making sure that you're following the norm of where those elements are. And maybe Joe, you could talk about some of the norms that you look for. Obviously, when you're exploring for the first time with a touch, what's your assumption with regard to where certain things are on an app or on a mobile site in terms of where you'd look for those interactions?
So I'm typically looking for a main navigation menu, typically towards the top of the screen or the top left-hand corner of the screen. If it's a native app and it's an app that's going to lend itself to possibly having multiple tabs, I'm going along the bottom of the screen to look for those different tab elements. And then, in forms, I'm again looking, kind of to the center of the bottom right and end of the screen to find a submit button or a register button or whatever the form, the appropriate button is for the form.
Yeah, and he is a good, for anyone who's actually thinking about designing and thinking about, how would I sort of emulate Joe's world? It's actually quite reasonably simple to turn your iPhone into accessibility mode, where what you touch will be announced. If you double tap it, it will be selected. So, for a designer, it's possible for them to think about sort of having that sort of component in their own testing world where they're, even predictably testing it themselves in terms of discovery of elements using touch, because they can quite easily turn your screen and close your eyes, and you can get a feel for how easy it is to discover elements and whether they're where people expect them to be. So maybe Luca, you take the next one.
Yeah, the next one is about keyboard control and for touchscreen devices. And as we just discussed, the vast majority of users nowadays interact with touchscreen. And if you think about it, after the first iPhone came out, soon all the major manufacturers have followed the trend of basically removing the physical keyboard from mobile devices. But despite that, some users with visual, cognitive, or dexterity disability can still find the use of a physical keyboard more reliable and easy to use. So designers and developers have to make sure their websites and native apps support different input devices and also behave accordingly as soon as the user plug or unplug them. So for example, ensuring that the user is not forced to use the virtual keyboard instead of the physical one if a physical one is actually connected to the device. And moving to the next slide, talking about touch screen, touch target size and spacing. Of course, on mobile devices, interactive elements must be big enough and have enough distance from each other so that user can easily tap them with their fingers. Human fingers are very imprecise input devices, so small targets may be hard to reach or press, and targets that are too close to each other may get hit by mistake. So that's why different platform guidelines like Windows, Apple, and Android indicate that touch target size should range between 7 to 10 millimeters. But in general, 7 millimeters should be considered as the ideal good enough size across different devices. Now, on the web, we typically use pixels as the default size unit. iOS uses point, Android uses dp. So how do millimeter translate in all these units? And the answer to this question is pretty easy, because at the pixel density of 160 dpi, they are all the same. So at the 160 dpi is actually the de facto standard for touchscreen pixels, where 1 pixel equals 1 point and 1 dp. So at 160 dpi, 44 pixels equals to 7 millimeters of actual physical size. And the WCAG indicates exactly the same thing. So targets for pointer inputs should have a minimum size of 44 by 44 pixels if you want to meet the highest AAA level of compliance. And Jason, on mobile screens, we use our fingers to perform gestures, which may be sometimes easy and sometimes very challenging to perform. What can you say about it?
Yeah, the key here is I really like some of the interfaces you see to sort of add interaction and sort of almost add sort of a brand experience. The two example, an example we have on screen is where, to confirm, for example, a purchase, you use your finger outline to finish the tick. But I think it's also important to understand that some people have mobility impairments that would actually be quite challenging. So always provide a alternative, easier method, or maybe more traditional method to execute the same thing. Joe, maybe you could give us also your sort of pet peeve of examples where you find yourself needing to do something which is harder than it needs to be.
The one that comes to mind for me recently was in my banking app. In order for me to transfer money from, say, my checking account to my savings account, the final step is to slide my finger along the screen. For a while, there was no alternative to that. So, I couldn't interact with that properly with VoiceOver. So it's subsequently been resolved, but initially that was an issue.
Yeah, I mean, the key on interfaces is, I believe that apps should be innovative, but if you are doing something which is innovative, you always want to make sure there's a sort of a backup plan for people who may find that as Joe's example, like inaccessible for them, and it will be easier for them to execute. So, Luca, I think that this is the manipulation of gestures. It sort of sits in the same space, right? It's other examples of how people can be innovative with regard to like how an app works. Allowing people to use the device, the fact that it's mobile. For example, tilt to achieve something. Maybe even indicating the landscape mode reveals something new. Again, there's clear examples where, for example, some people who have mobility impairment have a device that's locked on, in a particular mode on their vehicle, that won't allow them to do those types of things. So, always thinking about what's the common way that someone can do everything, but then how do you keep the clever stuff to add functionality, add an experience as opposed to block an experience.
Yes, exactly. So basically, and this is this slide here. It's a very good example about that. It all comes down that good accessibility is about always providing alternatives for user interactions. So as per this example here, also, and as you stated, it's about thinking about how users will basically interact not only with the interface, but also with the physical device that they are using. And if we move to the next slide, good accessibility is actually also about providing mechanisms that allows the user to undo or abort actions. Not only users with cognitive disabilities, but also people with tremor, mobility impairments, or just simply someone in a hurry may touch on the wrong screen location by mistake, experiencing an unexpected behavior of the application. So users should always be able to abort or undo an unintended action, like, for example, the ability of sliding the finger away from a button and lifting it without triggering any action. And the best practices here, both for web as well as native apps, are basically the same. So on the web, we should design interactions that are triggered on the mouse up event, whereas on a mobile, we should design interaction around the touch end event, which is basically the mobile equivalent of the mouse up event. Next, we have principle number 3, which is understandable. As you can imagine, the understandable principle is about, of course, understanding the content we are interacting with. So things to consider here are, is our content clearly written? Are all the interactions easy to understand? And does the order of the page elements make sense? So Jason, let's start by talking about visual consistency of content across different viewports.
Yeah, this goes back down to that sort of expected behavior. Don't make people explore or discover your content twice, or your feature or your functions twice, right? So if you're building things on mobile, but also work on tablet, although you have bigger screen, you want to make sure that you're maintaining or benefiting from the fact that they're learning how to use your app or your mobile site in one device, and making sure that you're not making them have to learn again in the second device. I think I saw a question about, what's our thoughts about, changing where navigation is. Again, I think that goes back down to, consider that people are learning how to use mobile sites and mobile apps in general across all of their experiences, not just your experience. So, they're building a mental model. Joe can talk a little bit about this, like how he builds a mental model of just generally how to use his mobile phone, and then how does that help him discover new applications and new websites. Maybe Joe, you can talk about that, how the mental model is important to you.
Well, we talked about this a little bit earlier, just about, how I map out in my head what maybe a particular area, like an e-commerce site is laid out, or a banking app is laid out. So I have it mapped out in my head of, generally speaking, what I'm expecting from the interface. So I'm looking up top as I'm either using swipe gestures or just doing touch exploration, I'm looking for that navigation menu to get a feel for, what's in the navigation menu, and then proceeding down through the page to see what content is available. And again, where it's appropriate, if it's a type of app that would have multiple tabs, identifying what those tabs are for, and then exploring those tabs to see what's there. And that's how I generally, at least initially, get a feel for a new application.
Great. Luca, I think you take the next one.
Yeah, and what Joe just said is strongly related to this slide here, because alongside consistency, also content prioritization is very important, especially on small screens, where we can display actually a very limited amount of content without the need of scrolling. And prioritizing content or page element is very important because it helps users focus more quickly and easily on the main purpose of the page, especially when, for example, also the virtual keyboard pops out that takes away a lot of screen real estate. So content prioritization is important for users with low vision and cognitive impairments because it makes the page content more predictable and therefore more understandable. And also users with screen magnifier can also benefit from content prioritization because they can easily access the content without having to scroll the page first and then move the magnified area on top of it. And next we have grouping operable elements. Jason, also users using screen reading technology can be have to be able to easily identify interactive or actionable elements, right?
Yeah, and I think again, this is one of those things where, once someone says this is obvious, but essentially sometimes an app or a mobile site uses an icon, then has a label for it in the visualization. And there are actually two elements in the actual code. If there are two elements in the code, then they're going to be represented in a screen reader world or a touch world as two elements, and that can be confusing. So essentially making sure that if you are using icons with labels, you're combining them and giving them one purpose and one label, and essentially making, again, less is more when it comes to making sure the accessibility of the interface.
Next, we have provide clear indications that elements are actionable. So in general, interactive elements should always be clearly distinguishable from non-active elements, and they should be styled and labeled in such a way they are easy to use not only for visual users, but also for users using assistive technology. So in other words, it all comes down to using good and well-established conventions, whether we are designing for the web or native apps, because basically it benefits all the users. And actionable elements can be made more distinguishable by using, for example, conventional shapes for interactive elements, like using rounded corners or drop shadows for buttons, everything that improves the perceived affordance of the element we are designing. Then, of course, by using conventional iconography, like, for example, using the question mark for providing some sort of information, or the magnifying glass for identifying the search feature. Then, of course, by using color offset and style, for example, using different color and the underlined style for text links in comparison with plain text. And finally, conventional positioning. So, as you may know, on iOS, we can navigate different sections of an app by using the tab navigation placed on the bottom of the view. On Android, instead, it's very common to find the same navigation element positioned on the top of the page. And if we move to the next slide, in terms of screen reader support and voice recognition, we should also we have to make sure that interactive elements have meaningful and descriptive labels. And we also have to make sure that the visual label and the accessible name of these elements are the same, so they are matching. I have another question for Joe. Did you find yourself in a situation where elements within a website or an app had poor description or no description at all?
I can't hear Joe. This is Bethany.
Joe, are you with us? If not, Luca, we'll go to the next one just while Joe gets reconnected.
Okay, and we have one more example for principle number 3, which is providing instruction. So, of course,
Okay.
Hey, Joe.
Do we have me now?
Yep.
Love when technology fails you. Just a few days ago, I had a situation where it was a form that required uploading a file, but from different sources, and one of the buttons was labeled "Choose File." And where am I choosing file from? What source? So some of the buttons were labeled properly, and then there was one which I determined later was from my computer, but it didn't clearly identify that. Obviously, links that are not labeled "click here" or just "link" is not going to really tell me a lot. Sometimes I can, if it says "click here," I can maybe make out what it's for from the surrounding content, but not always. Not always.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I think also directional instruction are another topic that are somehow connected here. Like, for example, when a label or a piece of paragraph says, click here on the right, where, for example, a user is not supposed to see to be able to see the interface. So always double check how you provide instructions and direction to your users, because they may find the same in different contexts. So user shouldn't be able to just let's say see the actual visual presentation of the layout, but interfaces should also speak without the visual part in terms of supporting accessibility. And as I was about to present, we have one more example for principle 3, which is about providing instructions. Of course, as we discussed earlier, custom touchscreen or device manipulation gesture, of course, can help create more efficient and engaging user experiences, but still for many people, they can be challenging for discover and perform. So for this reason, providing instructions like overlays, tooltips, or tutorials should always be available in order to explain what gestures can be used and whether there are alternatives or simpler version of this type of interactions. Instructions should also be easy to find and discover, and should also be available anytime the user needs them, and not just on the first use of the application. All right, and we have one more principle to discuss, which is the last one, robust. Robust is about how much your website or application remains accessible as technology evolves. And questions to consider here are, does your website or app only support the newest or latest browser or operating system version? or while creating your app, are you applying the best practices, not only in terms of device support and background compatibility, but also in order to make your website or app more future-friendly? And the first example comes from the web world. So, for example, with HTML5, we can now create more engaging mobile experiences for our users, for example, while they are filling in information into form fields. For example, by specifying the field type like credit card, phone number, or date, the user will get served with the matching keyboard for the requested information. And this technique is super useful because helps reduce the chance of format error for the users while they are filling data inside fields. And the last example, let's consider platform features here. So at the platform level, both iOS and Android provide many features to help users with disabilities interact with content like zoom, larger font, increased contrast modes, or shortcuts to mimic complex gestures. And for example, both iOS and Android provide accessibility feature for zooming and magnifying screen content. So on iOS, the three-finger double tap gesture activates the zoom feature, whereas on Android, the same feature gets triggered with just one finger double tap. So as you can see, these features are definitely not standardized across these platforms. So you have to make sure you get familiar with the ones you are designing for. And that's basically it. Jason, I pass the ball to you.
Yes. I think the last slide, Bethany is really talking about that all the content that we've got here, that you've heard here today, is actually in a white paper form. Lots of technical elements, sort of connecting the WCAG's sort of web world to the mobile world. And as I said, most of this has been authored and produced by Luca. And you'll get access to this. I think I want to bring Bethany in to sort of close this up, maybe bring a couple of Q&A questions. But I wanted to let everyone know that if you do ask a question, or you did ask a question, we know where it came from and we can respond to that individually. So don't worry if we're running out of time and you think, well, no one's going to answer my question. Please submit it. We will come back to you individually on that question.
Okay, great. And we should have time for just a couple of questions here. If you have to drop, I want to thank you for joining today. There is a survey that will pop up. It's just 3 quick questions that let us know, how you found the content of the webinar, and helps us when we plan webinars and future content. So if you could take a minute to fill that out. It's only 3 questions, and it's super helpful to us here. And we'll go ahead and get into a couple of the questions that we received. One of the questions is, for a native app, giving a lot of information on a small screen is the key takeaway to ensure that touch target size is good. Another question is basically the case that swipe or tab navigation is the navigation method of last resort. I have 2 questions there.
Luke, you want to take the first one?
So can you repeat, please, Bethany, the first question? So just to make sure I've understood the topic.
Yeah, so it came in pretty, I think, kind of early on. For a native app, giving a lot of information on a small screen is the key takeaway to ensure that the touch target size is good.
Yeah, definitely, because as I said, let's say human fingers are very imprecise input devices. So you have to make sure that everything that the user is supposed to interact with has occupies enough area in order to allow the fingers to basically be targeted by our fingers. So yes, we have to take into consideration that touch targets should have a minimum standard size that allows basically the fingers to target them and perform an action correctly.
And just to answer the second one, which I think was sort of what is the main default way to make sure that you test an interface? Joe uses touch a lot. Other people might not use touch a lot because they're actually, that touch is not as an accurate component for them. They have mobility issues. A lot of people have, average eyesight or poor eyesight, so they use zoom. So they're actually going to zoom in on an interface. The final sort of the bottom line is that in the same as in web, if someone wants to navigate through elements, they're going to use a swiping gesture to go element by element by element. And that is obviously the last resort, making sure that every element on the page is accessible using swipe, and making sure that in some way it's organized in a way that makes, if I'm using swipe gesture, not a painful experience. So not creating lots and lots of elements in front, potentially having ways for people to skip over lots of multiple elements as well. So that was maybe my answer on the second one.
That brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you so much for watching today. If you have questions for our accessibility experts or our presenters, feel free to reach out to us on the UsableNet website, or you can email contact@usablenet.com.